Welcome to Tales by Imon. Tonight, we delve into a story of secrets and shadows, a tale that unfolds in a town that prides itself on its tranquility. But as we'll soon discover, even the most peaceful valleys can hide the darkest of secrets. So, settle in, and let the story of Harmony Valley begin. The last breath of summer clung to Harmony Valley, a stubborn warmth that belied the crisp undercurrent of approaching autumn. In this sleepy Pennsylvania town, nestled amidst the rolling Appalachian Mountains, life moved at the pace of the gentle stream that bisected its heart. It was a town of picket fences and freshly baked apple pies cooling on windowsills, a place where everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. For Sheriff Brody Evans, Harmony Valley was both his sanctuary and his watch. He'd grown up here, his memories painted with the vibrant hues of changing seasons against the familiar backdrop of the town's quaint main street. He'd left for a time, chasing a sense of purpose in the bustling city of Philadelphia, but the valley had called him back, its quiet embrace a balm to his world-weary soul. Now, in his late 30s, with a face that was beginning to show the lines of his dedication, he was the steadfast guardian of its peace. The morning of September 5th began like any other. The sun, a brilliant artist, painted streaks of orange and pink across the eastern sky. Brody sat in his usual booth at the Daily Grind, the town's only coffee shop, nursing a mug of black coffee that was as strong and dark as his resolve. The familiar aroma of roasted beans and sizzling bacon filled the air, a comforting symphony to start the day. He exchanged pleasantries with Martha, the cheerful owner whose smile was as much a town fixture as the old clock tower in the town square. He nodded to old Mr. Abernathy, who was meticulously reading the local paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was a scene of idyllic normalcy, a tableau of small-town life that Brody cherished. But a single phone call was about to shatter that illusion. His phone buzzed on the worn wooden table, the screen displaying a name he hadn't seen in years, Caleb Miller. A frown creased Brody's brow. Caleb had been his childhood best friend, a wild spirit with a mischievous grin who had left Harmony Valley a decade ago, chasing dreams of adventure and fortune. Their paths had diverged, their friendship a casualty of time and distance. Brody answered, a sense of unease prickling at the back of his neck. Caleb! The voice on the other end was strained, a stark contrast to the carefree laughter Brody remembered. Brody, I need your help. Caleb, what's wrong? Where are you? I'm back in town. Something's happened, at the old Blackwood Manor. The mention of Blackwood Manor sent a shiver down Brody's spine. The dilapidated mansion on the outskirts of town was a place of local legend, a skeletal silhouette against the skyline that had fueled the nightmares of generations of Harmony Valley children. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its history shrouded in whispers of tragedy and misfortune. What were you doing at the manor, Caleb? Brody's voice was firm, the sheriff in him taking over. I found something. Something I wasn't supposed to see. Brody, you have to come. Alone. The line went dead. A knot of apprehension tightened in Brody's stomach. He left a few bills on the table and walked out of the Daily Grind, the comforting morning scene now feeling like a distant memory. The drive to Blackwood Manor was a journey into the darker side of Harmony Valley, a side that most residents chose to ignore. The paved road soon gave way to a gravel path, the trees on either side growing taller and more imposing, their branches interlocking overhead to form a shadowy tunnel. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The manor loomed before him, a gothic monstrosity of faded grandeur. Its windows were like hollow eyes, staring out at a world that had long since forgotten it. Ivy snaked its way up the stone walls, its green tendrils a stark contrast to the decaying wood and crumbling facade. Brody parked his truck and approached the imposing oak doors, which hung ajar, an unspoken invitation into the darkness within. Caleb, he called out, his voice echoing in the unnerving silence. He drew his service weapon, the familiar weight a small comfort in the oppressive atmosphere. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on the debris that littered the grand foyer. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced through the grimy windows, illuminating a scene of forgotten opulence. A grand staircase, its banister coated in a thick layer of dust, spiraled upwards into the gloom. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and secrets. He moved cautiously through the decaying rooms, his senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet and the frantic beating of his own heart. He found Caleb in the library, a vast room lined with empty bookshelves that stood like skeletal sentinels. Caleb was huddled in a corner, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that Brody had never seen in him before, not even in their most reckless childhood adventures. Caleb, what is it? What did you find? Brody asked, his voice a low, steadying presence in the cavernous room. Caleb didn't speak. He simply pointed a trembling finger towards the far end of the library. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a section of the wall that looked different from the rest. The wallpaper was torn, revealing a dark, gaping hole. And from within that hole, a faint, sweet, cloying odor emanated. It was a smell that Brody, in his years as a lawman, had come to associate with only one thing: death. As he moved closer, a sense of dread washed over him. He shone his flashlight into the opening, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a small, hidden chamber. And in the center of that chamber, lying on a cold, stone floor, was a human skeleton. The bones were yellowed with age, a silent testament to a long-held secret. But it wasn't just the presence of the skeleton that sent a chill down Brody's spine. It was the small, tarnished silver locket that lay nestled amongst the rib cage. He recognized it instantly. It was the locket that had belonged to Amelia Thompson, a girl who had vanished from Harmony Valley 20 years ago, a case that had gone cold, a ghost that had haunted the town ever since. The dark secret of Harmony Valley was beginning to unravel, and Sheriff Brody Evans was standing right at the heart of it. The idyllic peace of his town was a fragile veneer, and he was about to discover the terrifying truth that lay just beneath the surface. The whispers of the past were about to become a deafening scream. The silence in the library was a physical weight, pressing in on Sheriff Brody Evans, thick with the dust of forgotten years and the new, horrifying scent of death. For a long moment, he could only stare at the skeletal remains illuminated by his flashlight beam, the tarnished silver locket winking back at him like a malevolent eye. Amelia Thompson. The name echoed in the chambers of his memory. She was a ghost from his own past, a high school classmate with a bright, infectious laugh who had simply vanished one summer night 20 years ago. The town had searched, theories had flown, a runaway, a kidnapping, but eventually, the case had turned cold, buried under the weight of time and the town's desperate desire to maintain its peaceful facade. Now, her final resting place was revealed, not in some distant city, but here, in the cold, dark heart of Harmony Valley. Brody's training kicked in, a cold wave of professionalism washing over the initial shock. He took a deep, steadying breath, the musty air filling his lungs. "Don't touch anything," he said, his voice low and firm, directed at Caleb, who was still frozen in the corner. "Don't move." He slowly backed out of the hidden chamber, his eyes scanning the immediate area. This was a crime scene, 2 decades old, but a crime scene nonetheless. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the number for his deputy. But first, he needed answers. He turned his attention back to his old friend. Caleb looked like a cornered animal, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Caleb," Brody said, softening his tone slightly. "Talk to me. Start from the beginning. Why are you here?" Caleb swallowed hard, his gaze darting from Brody to the dark opening in the wall. "I got a letter," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "A few weeks ago. No return address. It said if I wanted to know what really happened to my sister, I should look in the Blackwood Library." Brody's blood ran cold. "Your sister? What does your sister have to do with this?" A look of profound grief crossed Caleb's face. "My older sister, Clara. She left town a few months after Amelia disappeared. She said she couldn't stand it here anymore, couldn't stand the whispers. We thought she just ran off, started a new life. We haven't heard from her since." He choked on a sob. The letter said Harmony Valley took them both. It said the truth was buried here. This new piece of information hit Brody like a physical blow. 2 missing girls, connected by a cryptic, anonymous letter. This wasn't just a cold case, it was a conspiracy that had been festering for 20 years. "You came here alone based on an anonymous letter?" Caleb nodded, shamefaced. "I had to know, Brody. It's been eating at me for 20 years. I didn't want to cause a stir until I knew for sure. I spent the last 2 days searching this godforsaken place. I was about to give up when I noticed the wallpaper was loose behind that old bookshelf." He gestured with a shaky hand. "I pulled it away, and the bricks behind it were loose. I found her." Brody processed the information, his mind racing. Someone wanted this grave to be found. Someone had sent Caleb here, knowing what he would uncover. But why now? After all this time? "Where's the letter, Caleb?" "I burned it," he said quickly. "I was scared. It said not to tell anyone, especially not the police. And yet you called me. Because it's you, Brody." Caleb's voice rose with a desperate edge. "I didn't know who else to trust. This town, it has secrets. You know it does. Deep, dark ones. People in this town aren't who they seem." Brody knew Caleb was right. Every small town had its share of skeletons in the closet, but he was beginning to suspect Harmony Valley was built on a veritable graveyard. He finally made the call. "Mark, it's Brody. I need you and a forensics team out at the old Blackwood Manor. And I mean the state team. Call them in. And Mark, seal off the entire property. Nobody gets in or out without my say-so. We have a body." He paused, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Possible homicide. The victim might be Amelia Thompson. He ended the call and looked back at Caleb. The terror in his friend's eyes had been replaced by a chilling resignation. "You think you can solve this, don't you?" Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. "You think you can just march in here and uncover the truth? It's my job, Caleb." Caleb let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "This isn't some random crime, Brody. This is different. The people who did this, they're still here. They're woven into the fabric of this town. They're probably sipping coffee at the Daily Grind right now, smiling and waving as you drive by." He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. Finding her wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning. Brody watched him, a growing sense of dread coiling in his gut. The sun was higher in the sky now, but its light couldn't penetrate the oppressive gloom of the manor. He could already hear the distant wail of sirens, a sound that would soon rip through the manufactured peace of Harmony Valley, signaling that the ghosts of the past were no longer content to whisper. They were about to scream. As the first patrol car pulled up the gravel drive, Caleb grabbed Brody's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes, wide with fear, locked onto the sheriff's. "Brody, listen to me," he hissed, his voice urgent and low. "The letter, it had one more thing. A symbol. An carving of an owl with its wings spread. It said to beware the Parliament of Trees." Before Brody could ask what he meant, Caleb's eyes darted towards the doorway, a fresh wave of panic washing over him. "They know," he whispered, his face ashen. "They know I found her. They'll be coming for me." The words hung in the air, a chilling prophecy that promised the discovery of the skeleton was not an end, but the start of a new and terrifying chapter for everyone in Harmony Valley. The flashing lights of Deputy Mark Riley's cruiser painted the decaying facade of Blackwood Manor in surreal strokes of red and blue, a modern intrusion on a century of rot. Mark, a young man whose earnest face usually wore a look of placid calm, now appeared pale and wide-eyed as he stepped out of his car. He was a good deputy, diligent and loyal, but the biggest crime he'd had to handle in his 3 years on the job was a string of garden gnome thefts. This was different. This was the town's most infamous ghost story come to life. "Sheriff," Mark said, his voice tight as he approached Brody. "What have we got?" "Seal this place off, Mark. Top to bottom," Brody ordered, his gaze fixed on Caleb, who was now trembling uncontrollably. He placed a steadying hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I'm taking Mr. Miller back to the station. He's a material witness. He's not to be questioned by anyone but me. Understand?" Mark nodded, his eyes flicking to Caleb with a mixture of pity and professional curiosity. "Yes, sir. State forensics is about an hour out." "Good. Keep everyone out, and I mean everyone. The press will be on this like vultures once word gets out. I want this scene preserved perfectly." Brody guided Caleb toward his own truck, away from the growing number of official vehicles arriving. Caleb's words, "They know I found her," echoed in his mind. He had to get him somewhere safe. The sheriff's station, with its brick walls and steel doors, felt like the only sanctuary he could offer. The drive back to town was a tense, silent affair. Caleb stared out the window, his reflection a ghostly image against the passing trees. The familiar, winding roads of Harmony Valley, which usually brought Brody a sense of peace, now seemed menacing. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, every quiet farmhouse a potential hiding place for a decades-old evil. Caleb's warning about the town's residents being woven into this conspiracy had poisoned the well. Brody found himself glancing at the faces of people he'd known his whole life, the friendly mailman, the woman tending her garden, and seeing them through a new, suspicious lens. Who among them was capable of this? Who had helped bury Amelia Thompson and her secrets? Back at the station, the fluorescent lights of the small office felt harsh and sterile after the gloom of the manor. Brody sat Caleb down in the interview room, a small, windowless space designed to feel claustrophobic. He brought him a cup of water, his hand shaking slightly as he took it. "Caleb, I need you to focus," Brody began, his voice calm and even. "I believe you're in danger. But for me to protect you, I need to know everything. This symbol you mentioned, an owl." Caleb nodded, tracing the shape on the metal table with a trembling finger. An owl with its wings spread wide. Like it's watching everything. It was embossed at the bottom of the letter, no signature, just the owl. And the phrase, "Beware the Parliament of Trees?" That's what it said. It doesn't make any sense to me. Brody leaned forward. "Think, Caleb. Did you ever hear that phrase growing up?" or see that symbol anywhere around town. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, his mind a whirlwind of fear and fragmented memories. No, I don't think so. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale. A creepy one. Brody knew he wouldn't get much more from him tonight. The man was in shock, haunted by what he'd found. All right, you're going to stay here for now. There's a small cot in the back holding cell. It's not comfortable, but it's safe. No one gets through that door without coming through me first. Leaving Caleb in the relative safety of the locked cell, Brody walked back to his own office. The sun had set, and darkness had fallen over Harmony Valley, a blanket that no longer felt comforting. He sat down at his heavy oak desk, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Amelia Thompson was dead. Clara Miller was missing. And it was all connected to a secret society that used an owl as its symbol and a cryptic phrase as its warning. He felt a deep-seated frustration. He was the sheriff, but he was chasing ghosts. He needed something tangible, a thread to pull on. On a whim, he walked over to a tall filing cabinet that held the town's archives, a dusty collection of records that hadn't been touched in years. He pulled out a drawer labeled Town Planning and History. Inside, beneath brittle zoning permits and faded blueprints, was a collection of old maps. He carefully unrolled one, a hand-drawn map of Harmony Valley from the late 1800s. His eyes scanned the familiar landmarks, rendered in elegant, looping script. He saw the spot where his own house now stood, the area designated for the town square, the creek that still babbled through the center of town. And then he saw it. On the western edge of the map, bordering the sprawling state forest and sitting directly behind the plot of land marked Blackwood Estate, was a section of dense woods. Inked in the same elegant script was a name for that part of the forest, a name that made the hair on his arms stand on end. It was labeled the Parliament. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a place. A real, physical location hidden in the deep woods behind the very manor where Amelia's body lay. Brody stared at the map, the pieces beginning to click into place with an ominous finality. A parliament is a term for a group of owls. The Parliament of Trees. It was a meeting place. A place where the darkest secrets of Harmony Valley had been nurtured for generations. He now had a destination, a direction for his investigation. But a chilling thought occurred to him as he stood alone in the quiet station. He was heading into the heart of their territory, and he had no idea how many of them there were, or how deep their roots in his town truly ran. Sleep offered no escape for Sheriff Brody Evans. He spent the night on the thin mattress of his office cot, the hand-drawn map of old Harmony Valley spread on the floor beside him. The name, the Parliament, seemed to burn in the low light, a brand mark on his town's history. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hollow sockets of Amelia Thompson's skull and the terrified face of Caleb Miller. By the time the first gray light of dawn filtered through his window, Brody was already on his second cup of bitter, black coffee. The uneasy quiet of the station was a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside its walls. As he predicted, word had spread. Harmony Valley, a town that thrived on routine and predictability, had woken up to a nightmare. The news wasn't official, not yet, but a discovery of human remains at the haunted Blackwood Manor was a piece of gossip too potent to be contained. Brody could feel the change in the air as he made a quick trip to the daily grind for a coffee he didn't need and a breakfast he couldn't eat. The usual morning chatter was replaced by hushed whispers. Glances were exchanged over the rims of coffee cups. He saw fear in some eyes, a morbid curiosity in others. He felt like an outsider in his own home, the keeper of a truth so ugly it threatened to curdle the very soul of the town. Back at the station, Deputy Mark Riley was waiting, his face etched with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. "Forensics confirmed it, Sheriff," Mark said, his voice low. "The remains are consistent with a female, late teens, deceased approximately 20 years. They're expediting dental record comparison with Amelia Thompson's file. And they found something else. Microfractures on the hyoid bone, consistent with strangulation. Murder." The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a deliberate, violent act. "Anything else?" Brody asked, his jaw tight. "Just that the hidden room was designed to be concealed. The brickwork was professional. Whoever put her there intended for her to stay hidden forever." Brody nodded slowly, the pieces falling into a grim mosaic. He led Mark into his office and unrolled the old map on his desk. He pointed to the wooded area behind the Blackwood estate. "Caleb gave me something," he said. "A phrase from the letter he received. Beware the Parliament of Trees." He tapped the named location on the map. "This is the Parliament." Mark stared at the map, his brow furrowed. "I've hiked all over these woods my whole life. I've never heard that name." "It's an old name," Brody explained. "Lost to time, I guess." A parliament is a group of owls. Caleb also said the letter had a symbol of an owl on it. The realization dawned on Mark's face. You think it's a place? A meeting spot? I'm sure of it, Brody said. And I'm sure that whatever secrets this town is hiding, the routes lead right back to that spot in the woods. We're going to check it out. Quietly. Just the two of us. Grab your gear. We go in on foot from the North Ridge. I don't want anyone seeing my truck near the manor. An hour later, they were deep in the forest that bordered the Blackwood property. The air was cool and damp, smelling of pine and wet earth. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy of ancient oaks and maples, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. It was a beautiful, yet intimidating place. The further they walked, the quieter it became. The sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. Following the faded topography of the old map, they navigated through thickets and over moss-covered rocks. After nearly a mile of strenuous hiking, the landscape began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches seeming to interlock, forming a natural fortress. Then they found it. The woods opened abruptly into a perfectly circular clearing, a feature so unnatural it was clear it had been man-made. The grass was unnaturally short, as if tended to, and in the exact center stood a colossal ancient oak tree. Its gnarled branches reached towards the sky like skeletal fingers, and its trunk was wider than any Brody had ever seen. As they drew closer, a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept down Brody's spine. The massive trunk of the oak was covered in carvings. Dozens of them. Each one was the symbol Caleb had described, an owl, its wings spread wide. Some were faded and covered in moss, so old they were barely visible. Others were clearer, etched deep into the bark. They seemed to be arranged in a deliberate pattern, spiraling up the trunk. My God, Mark breathed, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered sidearm. What is this place? A ledger, Brody whispered, his eyes tracing the grim tally. It was a history book written in scars on living wood. He walked around the base of the tree, his boots crunching softly on the twigs and leaves. On the side hidden from their approach, he stopped. There, near the bottom of the trunk, was a carving that was starkly different from the others. The wood was fresh, the cuts clean and sharp. It was an owl, just like the others, but below it, two smaller marks were scratched into the wood. Two names, A.T. and C.M. Amelia Thompson and Clara Miller. Beneath the carving, the dirt was disturbed, a small patch of dark, turned-over soil. Brody knelt, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached out to touch the soil, a sudden, sharp sound split the silence of the woods. Snap. The distinct sound of a heavy branch breaking under a footstep. It came from the dense line of trees just beyond the clearing. Brody's head shot up. He locked eyes with Mark, his hand flying to his own weapon. They weren't alone. Someone was in the woods, watching them. And they had just walked, uninvited, into their most sacred place. The sharp crack of the twig sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Brody's veins. He and Mark spun around, weapons drawn, their backs pressed against the solid trunk of the ancient oak. The forest, which had been unnervingly quiet, now seemed alive with menace. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of the wind was a potential threat. They stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, straining their ears, their eyes scanning the dense, shadowy tree line that encircled the clearing. Police! Show yourself! Brody's voice was a commanding bark that cut through the tension, though it felt swallowed by the immense silence of the woods. There was no immediate response. Then, a slow, gravelly voice drifted from the shadows to their right. A little late for that, Sheriff. The real power in these woods doesn't wear a badge. Out from behind a thicket of rhododendrons stepped a man who looked as old and weathered as the forest itself. He was gaunt, with a wild mane of silver hair and a beard that reached his chest. His clothes were a patchwork of flannel and denim, and he leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick. But it was his eyes that held Brody's attention. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they burned with a fierce, weary intelligence. Brody recognized him instantly, though he hadn't seen him in years. It was Silas Croft, the town's former historian, who had become a recluse 2 decades ago after his controversial theories about the town's founding families had gotten him fired from the local high school and shunned from the community. Silas ignored their drawn weapons, his gaze fixed on the carved trunk of the great oak. "So you found their church," he said, his voice raspy. "Took you long enough. Silas, what are you doing out here?" Brody asked, slowly lowering his weapon, though his hand remained close to its grip. Mark, following his lead, did the same. "I live out here," Silas retorted, gesturing vaguely towards the deeper woods. "It's safer than living in town. Fewer predators." He hobbled closer, his eyes lingering on the fresh carving with the initials AT and CM. They were always meticulous record keepers. Vain. They want their work to be remembered, even if only by themselves. "What is this place, Silas?" Mark asked, his voice full of a nervous energy. "What work?" Silas turned his piercing gaze on the young deputy. "This, son, is the Parliament. The true seat of power in Harmony Valley since its founding. Not the town hall. This clearing." He rapped his walking stick against the base of the oak. "And this is their charter, their history, their list of transgressions." "You're talking about a secret society," Brody stated, the pieces connecting in his mind. "Secret is a polite word for it," Silas scoffed. "They are the founding families. The Wentworths, the Blackwoods, the Prestons. They convinced everyone they were building a utopia, a harmonious valley. But it was a fortress. Their own private kingdom, built on secrets and control. The owl is their symbol. They see all, they know all, and they act from the shadows to protect the town's interests, which has always meant protecting their own." Brody thought of the prominent families in town. Mayor Wentworth, Judge Preston, families whose names were on buildings and street signs, their influence undeniable. "What happened to you, Silas? Why did you disappear?" A shadow of pain crossed the old man's face. "I got too close. I was researching the town's history and found discrepancies, whispers of people who opposed the founders and just vanished. I started connecting the dots. They don't like it when people connect the dots. They ruined my reputation, threatened my family. So I took to the woods, became a ghost. It was the only way to stay alive." He looked at Brody with a newfound intensity. They left Amelia Thompson in that manner as a message, a warning to anyone who stepped out of line. She was dating young Evan Wentworth, you see. He was going to leave town with her, turn his back on his family and his responsibilities to the Parliament. They couldn't allow that. The revelation was sickening. Amelia wasn't a random victim. She was a threat to their dynasty. "And Clara Miller?" Brody asked. "She knew something," Silas said grimly. "She was Amelia's best friend. I suspect she figured it out, or got too close to the truth herself. So they removed her from the board, too. Two problems, solved with the same brutal efficiency." Brody felt a cold fury rising within him. They have to be stopped. There has to be proof. Names. Something more than carvings on a tree. Silas nodded, a flicker of something like hope in his tired eyes. "There is. The Parliament, for all their secrecy, were arrogant. They kept a ledger, detailed minutes of their meetings, their decisions, a record of their reign. It used to be kept in the manor, but after it fell into disrepair, they moved it. Hidden in plain sight." "Where?" Brody demanded. "Go to the town hall archives," Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look for the owl's perch. That's all I can tell you. They'll be watching you, Sheriff. Finding that body was like kicking a hornet's nest. They're stirring now. You've brought the past into the present, and they will do anything, to bury it again." With that cryptic warning, the old historian turned and limped back into the trees, disappearing as silently as he had arrived, leaving Brody and Mark alone in the chilling clearing. The hike back was silent, the weight of Silas's words pressing down on them. The conspiracy was real, and its members were the most powerful people in town. When Brody finally reached the station, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the parking lot. As he approached his patrol truck, he saw something tucked under the driver's side windshield wiper. It was a single, perfect feather, dark brown and silent, with the unmistakable softness of an owl's plumage. It was a message, a quiet, terrifying promise. "We see you. We know where you've been. And we are always watching." Sheriff Brody Evans stood motionless in the parking lot, the setting sun casting his long shadow behind him. The owl feather felt impossibly light in his palm, yet it carried the weight of a tombstone. It was a declaration, a piece of the wild, ancient forest brought into his world of asphalt and order, a message that the walls of his town, of his station, of his very life, were no protection. They were watching. He carefully placed the feather in an evidence bag, his movements precise and mechanical, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging within him. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was being rapidly consumed by a simmering, righteous anger. This was his town. They would not take it from him. He knew he couldn't wait. The clue Silas had given him, the owl's perch, was his only lifeline, and he had to pursue it before the Parliament realized what he was looking for. The town hall was officially closed for the day, but as sheriff, he had a key. The problem wasn't getting into the building, the problem was getting into the archives. The archives were the personal fiefdom of Beatrice Hemlock, a woman who had been the town clerk since before Brody was born. Beatrice treated the town's records with the fierce, unyielding territoriality of a mother bear. He found her just as she was locking her office door, a formidable woman with a steel-gray bun and glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Beatrice," Brody said, his tone polite but firm. "I need access to the archives." Beatrice looked down her nose at him, her lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval. "The archives are closed, Sheriff. As is the town hall. Procedure is procedure. You can file a request in the morning." "This isn't a request," Brody said, his voice dropping to a level that left no room for argument. "It's official police business related to the investigation at the Blackwood property. I need access now." For a moment, Beatrice looked as though she might physically bar his way, but something in his eyes, a hard, unblinking resolve she had never seen in him before, made her back down. With a long, theatrical sigh, she unlocked the heavy oak door to the archives and flicked on the lights. 500 square feet of paper and dust, she sniffed. "Knock yourself out, Sheriff. Just don't misfile anything." She left the door ajar, a clear sign she would be listening from her office. The archives were exactly as he remembered from his rare visits, a cramped, windowless room that smelled of decaying paper and time itself. Wooden shelves reached from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound ledgers, cardboard boxes tied with string, and stacks of yellowed documents. It was the town's entire history, its memory, crammed into one suffocating space. Where to even begin? The Owl's Perch. A high place. He scanned the tops of the towering shelves, but saw nothing but more boxes and a thick layer of dust. He spent the next hour pulling down boxes at random, his search growing more frantic and hopeless. He found old tax records, birth certificates, property deeds, the mundane minutiae of a town's life, with no hint of its sinister underbelly. Frustrated, he leaned against a large metal filing cabinet in the center of the room to catch his breath. His gaze drifted across the cluttered space, and that's when he saw it. It wasn't on a shelf. It was on top of the very cabinet he was leaning against. A heavy, cast-iron desk lamp. Its base wasn't just a simple stand. It was an intricately detailed sculpture of an owl, its talons gripping a branch, its wings slightly spread. The Owl's Perch. It had been hidden in plain sight the entire time. His heart hammered against his ribs. The cabinet was old, its drawers sealed with rust and time. But Brody noticed something about the top drawer. It didn't have a handle, just a keyhole. Using the blade of his pocket knife, he worked at the lock, prying and jimmying until, with a sharp crack, it sprang open. The drawer was empty, save for a single, large object wrapped in oilcloth. Brody carefully lifted it out and placed it on the floor. As he unwrapped it, the smell of old leather and secrets filled the air. It was a book. A massive ledger, bound in dark, cracked leather. Embossed on the cover was a single, elegant symbol, an owl with its wings spread wide. His hands trembling, he opened it. The pages were filled with neat, cursive script, chronicling meetings that spanned over a century. He saw names he recognized from street signs and history books. Wentworth, Preston, Blackwood. He flipped through the years, the pages turning with a dry rustle. His eyes scanned for the summer of 20 years ago. He found the date, July 12th, a week after Amelia Thompson was last seen. The entry was chilling in its corporate-like sterility. Meeting of the Parliament held. Topic: the Wentworth contingency. A foreign element was threatening the integrity of a founding bloodline and the future harmony of the valley. After deliberation, it was unanimously decided to excise the threat. The Blackwood Resolution was invoked. The asset was permanently retired and secured. Below the entry was a list of attendees who had approved the decision. He saw Mayor Wentworth's father. He saw Judge Preston's predecessor. And then he saw the last signature on the list, a familiar, confident scrawl that made the air leave his lungs in a single, gut-wrenching gasp. The signature was unmistakable. He'd seen it on birthday cards, on his high school diploma, on his own commendations. It was the signature of the man who had taught him right from wrong, the man whose badge he now wore. Sheriff Thomas Evans. His father. His own father had been a member of the Parliament. His father had signed the death warrant for a teenage girl. Brody sank to the floor, the heavy ledger in his lap, the world tilting on its axis. The conspiracy wasn't just in his town. It was in his blood. The world narrowed to the single page of the ledger, to the familiar, damning signature. Thomas Evans. Brody felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him, leaving him in a freefall through the ruins of his own life. Every memory of his father, a man he had revered as the pinnacle of integrity and justice, was now cast in a sinister new light. His father teaching him how to read a compass, his voice patient and kind. His father pinning on his deputy's badge, his eyes filled with a pride that had been Brody's guiding star. Had it all been a lie? Was the foundation of his entire moral code built on a bedrock of murder and secrets? The dusty air in the archive felt thick, unbreathable. He was suffocating under the weight of a legacy he never knew he had. A noise from the outer office, Beatrice Hemlock clearing her throat impatiently, jolted him back to the present. The cold instincts of a lawman, the very skills his father had taught him, took over. This grief, this betrayal, was a wound he would have to tend to later. Right now, the ledger was everything. He couldn't take it. Beatrice would know it was gone, and the Parliament would be alerted immediately. He pulled out his phone, his hands surprisingly steady. In the oppressive silence of the archive, the sharp, digital click of his phone's camera shutter sounded like a gunshot. He photographed the cover. He photographed the entry on the Wentworth contingency. And last, his finger hovering over the screen for a moment, he photographed the page of signatures, his father's name a dark stain at the bottom. He carefully placed the ledger back in its oilcloth wrapping, slid the drawer shut, and maneuvered the broken lock to look undisturbed. He walked out of the archives, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional disappointment. "Nothing," he said to Beatrice, the lie tasting like acid. "Just more dust. Thanks for your time." She gave him a suspicious look but said nothing as he walked out of the town hall and into the cool night air. He didn't go back to the station. He couldn't. Instead, he drove on autopilot to the small Cape Cod house on Elm Street where he'd grown up, the house he'd inherited when his father passed away 5 years ago. He walked through the silent rooms, each one a museum of a life he no longer understood. There on the mantel was the picture of his father in full uniform, a warm, reassuring smile on his face. Brody stared at it, searching for a hint of the monster he now knew was there, but he saw only the hero he had worshipped his entire life. He found himself in his father's old study, a room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. It had been left exactly as it was, a shrine he hadn't had the heart to dismantle. He ran his hand over the worn leather of his father's armchair, sat down at the heavy oak desk. This was where his father had worked on cases, where he had dispensed wisdom, where he had helped shape Brody's entire world. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need to understand, Brody began to search. He opened drawers, sifted through old, neatly organized case files, looking for anything related to Amelia Thompson or the Parliament. He found nothing. Of course he wouldn't. His father had been meticulous. Then he noticed it. The bottom right drawer of the desk. It was locked. He'd never had a reason to open it before. Now, it felt like the most important thing in the world. He found a small key in the back of his father's penholder and, with a click, the lock opened. The drawer was almost empty. It held only his father's service revolver, retired and gleaming, and a small, heavy metal box. It wasn't locked. Brody lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single object. It was a tie pin, exquisitely crafted from silver and onyx. It was in the shape of an owl, its wings spread wide, its small dark eyes seeming to stare right through him. The proof. Tangible, personal, undeniable. His father hadn't just been a member, he had worn their symbol. He had likely worn it to church, to town meetings, perhaps even while wearing his sheriff's uniform. The hypocrisy was a physical blow. Brody closed his eyes, the image of the tie pin burned into his mind. The grief was still there, a raw, gaping hole in his chest. But now, something else was crystallizing from the pain. A cold, hard resolve. His father's sins were not his own, but the duty to expose them was. He could not change what his father had done, but he could damn well make sure the rest of them didn't get away with it. He would not let the shadow of that owl cover his town for one more day. He stood up, leaving the box open on the desk. He pulled out his phone again and looked at the picture of the ledger page, at the list of names who had signed Amelia's death warrant. Some were dead, but some were not. And one name stood out, not just for its prominence, but for its connection to the victim. Wentworth. The current mayor, Richard Wentworth, was the son of the man whose name was second on the list, and the brother of the boy Amelia had been planning to run away with. He was at the very heart of it all. Brody's path was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. He had to confront the head of the snake. His next stop was the mayor's mansion. The drive to the Wentworth estate was like ascending to another world. The modest, tree-lined streets of Harmony Valley gave way to a winding private road, climbing a hill that overlooked the town like a king surveying his domain. At the top sat the mansion, a sprawling colonial behemoth of white columns and perfectly manicured lawns, illuminated by tasteful landscape lighting that made it glow like a beacon of wealth and power. It was a place designed to intimidate, to remind everyone else in the valley of their station. Tonight, Brody Evans was not intimidated. He was a hornet flying toward the nest. He was met at the door by a stone-faced housekeeper who led him through a cavernous, marble-floored foyer and into a mahogany-paneled study. Mayor Richard Wentworth was standing by a cold, imposing fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was a handsome man in his late 50s, with silvering hair and the easy, confident smile of someone who had never been told no. He was the public face of the Parliament's legacy, charming, polished, and rotten to the core. "Sheriff Evans," the mayor said, his voice smooth as silk. "An unexpected visit. I trust our town is sleeping peacefully tonight." "Not as peacefully as it was a few days ago, Mayor," Brody replied, his voice level. He remained standing, refusing the silent offer of a leather armchair. "I have a few questions about an old case that's recently been reopened. The disappearance of Amelia Thompson." The mayor's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something cold passed through his eyes. "A terrible tragedy. My family was deeply affected, as you can imagine. My younger brother, Evan, he was quite taken with the girl. Her vanishing nearly destroyed him." "I'm sure it was difficult," Brody said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "I believe you're familiar with a local organization, a society. They call themselves the Parliament." The glass in Wentworth's hand stopped halfway to his lips. The smile finally vanished, replaced by a mask of aristocratic disdain. "That's an old town myth, Sheriff. A ghost story told to frighten children. Surely you have better things to do than chase folklore." "I found their meeting minutes," Brody said, letting the words hang in the silent room. "A ledger, to be specific. It was very detailed. It mentioned something called the Wentworth contingency. It talked about excising a threat to your family's bloodline, and something called the Blackwood Resolution. It was dated the week Amelia disappeared." The mayor slowly lowered his glass, his knuckles white. He stared at Brody, his mind clearly racing, reassessing the small-town sheriff he had always dismissed. "You are trespassing on dangerous ground, son. Ground that has been settled for a very long time." "This ground has a body buried in it," Brody countered, taking a step closer. "And a ledger full of names. Your father's name was on it, Mayor. He signed off on the resolution." Wentworth let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "My father, like his father before him, did what was necessary to protect this town, to maintain its prosperity, its harmony. You see this?" He gestured around the opulent room. "This valley. It didn't happen by accident. It was forged by strong men making difficult choices, choices that men like you couldn't possibly comprehend." "Is that what you call it?" Brody's voice was low and laced with contempt. "A difficult choice? Strangling a teenage girl and hiding her body in a wall. She was a threat." Wentworth's voice rose, the polished veneer cracking to reveal the fanaticism beneath. "A nobody from the wrong side of the tracks who was going to lure my brother away from his duty, from his future. She was a weed, and we simply plucked her from the garden before she could ruin it." The casual cruelty of his words was staggering. Brody felt a visceral urge to lunge across the desk, but he held it in check. He had one last card to play. "My father's name was in that book, too." The statement hit Wentworth like a physical blow. He looked at Brody with a new understanding, a sliver of what might have been pity, but was quickly replaced by a cold calculation. "Yes," he said softly. "Thomas Evans was a good man, a loyal man. He understood the necessity of order. He understood that some things, some people, are more important than others. He made a sacrifice for the good of this valley. Are you prepared to disgrace his memory, to tear down the legacy of a man who gave everything for this town, all for some misplaced sentiment over a girl who has been dead for 20 years? "He was a murderer," Brody said, the words tasting like poison. "And so were all of you." As the final, accusatory word hung in the air, the study door opened. A young man, a younger, sharper version of the mayor, stepped in. It was Richard Wentworth Jr., the heir apparent. He looked from his father to Brody, sensing the tension. The generational line of the conspiracy stood right before him. The mayor turned his back on Brody, walking to his desk in a clear act of dismissal. He picked up a pen, his message clear. This conversation was over. "You should be more concerned with the living than the dead, Sheriff," Wentworth said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a venomous, chilling threat. "Your primary witness, Mr. Miller. He seems so fragile, locked away in that little cell of yours. It would be a terrible shame if you were to have an accident. Be careful what stones you turn over, Brody. You never know what's crawling underneath." The mayor's words hung in the air like poison gas, a direct and undeniable threat. For a frozen moment, Sheriff Brody Evans stood in the opulent study, the polite facade of Harmony Valley society stripped away to reveal the skull beneath. Then, the adrenaline hit him like a physical blow. Caleb. He had left him in the station, thinking it was the safest place in town. He now realized it was the one place the Parliament would know to look. He gave Mayor Wentworth a single, hard look, a silent promise of retribution, and turned without another word, walking swiftly out of the mansion. The drive back down the winding hill was a blur of controlled panic. Brody's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his truck's engine roaring as he pushed it faster than he ever had on these familiar roads. He fumbled for his phone, dialing the station's direct line. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, Deputy Mark Riley answered, his voice groggy. "Sheriff's Station." "Mark, it's Brody. Is everything okay? Is Caleb secure?" Brody's voice was sharp, urgent. "Yeah, Sheriff, everything's fine," Mark said, a yawn audible in his voice. "Quiet night. Brought Mr. Miller some dinner from the diner about an hour ago. He's asleep now. Did anyone come by the station, Mark? Anyone at all?" There was a pause. "Well, yeah. Dr. Alastair stopped by. Said the mayor had called him, asked him to check on Mr. Miller's health, given his agitated state. Said he was worried about him going into shock. The doc gave him a mild sedative to help him rest. Seemed reasonable." Ice flooded Brody's veins. Dr. Alastair, the kindly, white-haired town physician who had treated every citizen of Harmony Valley for the last 40 years. The man who had set Brody's arm when he'd fallen out of a tree as a boy. A pillar of the community. And a serpent. "Mark, get to the holding cell now." Brody yelled into the phone. "Check on Caleb. Check if he's breathing." He didn't wait for a response, throwing the phone onto the passenger seat and flooring the accelerator. The quaint houses of his town flashed by his windows, no longer looking like homes, but like a series of masks hiding an unspeakable evil. He screeched into the station's parking lot and burst through the main doors. Mark was standing in the hallway, his face ashen, his phone still clutched in his hand. "Sheriff, he's not waking up. His breathing is shallow. I don't know what to do." Brody shoved past him, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He unlocked the cell door and knelt beside Caleb, who was lying unnervingly still on the narrow cot. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. Brody pressed 2 fingers to Caleb's neck, finding a weak, thready pulse. "Call 911, he yelled at Mark. "Tell them potential overdose, possible poisoning. And get me the state police dispatcher on my radio now." As Mark scrambled to make the calls, Brody did a quick, frantic search of the cell. On the floor, half hidden under the cot, was a small, disposable syringe. Empty. Alastair hadn't given Caleb a sedative. He'd injected him with something far more lethal, something designed to mimic a natural death or a suicide. An overdose that would be easily explained away given Caleb's known distress. It was a clean, quiet, professional assassination attempt, and they had nearly succeeded. The next few minutes were a maelstrom of controlled chaos. Brody administered CPR, forcing air into Caleb's lungs, refusing to let him go. The local ambulance arrived, its sirens screaming through the night, but Brody waved them off from taking Caleb to the Harmony Valley Clinic. He couldn't trust it. He couldn't trust Dr. Alastair or any of his staff. Using the authority of his office and the urgency of the situation, he had the state police dispatcher arrange for a medical helicopter to meet them at a discreet landing zone just outside of town, diverting it to a major trauma center in Philadelphia. He was getting Caleb out of the Parliament's reach for good. As the paramedics loaded Caleb's still form into the ambulance for the short trip to the landing zone, Brody rode with him, unwilling to leave his side. The town he had sworn to protect had become enemy territory. Under the flashing lights, Caleb's eyelids fluttered. His eyes, unfocused and clouded with pain, found Brody's. His lips moved, and a faint, rasping whisper escaped. "The owl's nest." Caleb breathed, his voice barely audible over the hiss of the oxygen mask. "Not the tree, the school." His eyes rolled back into his head, and he was unconscious again. Brody stared at him, the cryptic words echoing in his mind. The owl's nest. The school. Silas Croft, the old historian, had been fired from the high school for getting too close. The Parliament's roots didn't just run through the woods and the town hall. They ran through the place that was meant to shape the town's children. Brody now had a new target, a new piece of the puzzle. As the ambulance raced through the night, taking his only witness away to an uncertain fate, Brody was left more alone than ever, with a chilling new direction for his hunt. The school. He was going back to school. The rhythmic beat of the helicopter's blades faded into the night, leaving Sheriff Brody Evans standing alone in the damp field, enveloped by an unnerving silence. The flashing lights were gone, Caleb was gone, and with them, the last vestiges of the official world Brody once belonged to. He was no longer just a sheriff investigating a crime. He was a man unmoored, adrift in a sea of conspiracy with no one to trust and nowhere to turn. The attack on Caleb inside his own station was a brutal, unequivocal message. You have no sanctuary. We can reach anyone, anywhere. He got back in his truck, the engine turning over with a familiar rumble that did little to comfort him. He drove not toward his empty house or the compromised station, but aimlessly through the sleeping streets, Caleb's desperate whisper echoing in his mind. The owl's nest, not the tree, the school. It was a drowning man's last gasp, a final, crucial clue. He thought of Silas Croft, the historian who had been publicly disgraced and professionally destroyed. His career had ended at Harmony Valley High School. Of course. The Parliament didn't just control the town's present, they controlled its past and, more importantly, its future. They weren't just cutting out weeds, they were cultivating the garden, ensuring that only the crops they approved of would ever grow. A cold, hard certainty settled over him. He had to go to the school. Now, before the sun rose, before the building filled with innocent children and not-so-innocent faculty. He drove to the high school, a sprawling brick building that looked dark and monolithic against the moonless sky. He parked in a back lot, hidden from the main road, and used his master key to let himself in through a side entrance. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, the sound unnervingly loud in the dead quiet of the building. The air inside was stale, smelling of floor wax and chalk dust. The only light came from the dim, green emergency signs that cast long, eerie shadows down the cavernous hallways. His footsteps echoed on the polished linoleum. Rows of metal lockers stood like silent sentinels. It was a place he knew well, a place of youthful memories, but tonight it felt alien and hostile, a mausoleum of secrets. He made his way to the administrative wing, to the small, dusty room that served as the school's archives. He was looking for one thing: Silas Croft's old classroom assignment. He found it in a faculty ledger from 20 years ago. Room 207. The old history room. Room 207 was at the end of a long, dark corridor on the second floor. The classroom had been converted into a storage space, filled with old desks, outdated textbooks, and forgotten science fair projects. It was an attempt to erase Silas's memory, to bury his legacy under years of accumulated junk. Brody set to work, his search methodical and quiet. He checked behind bookshelves, under loose floorboards, inside the vents. He was looking for something a desperate, intelligent man would hide, a final break glass in case of emergency package. His eyes fell upon a large, framed portrait hanging on the wall, a stern-looking man with mutton chop sideburns. The plaque beneath read, Nathaniel Preston, Town Founder, 1848. One of the original Parliament patriarchs. Brody remembered Silas's words. They are vain. He ran his fingers along the heavy wooden frame. Near the top, his fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible latch. He pressed it. With a soft click, the entire portrait swung away from the wall like a door, revealing a small, dark cavity carved into the plaster. Inside sat a metal lockbox. Brody pried it open with his knife. It was filled with Silas Croft's life's work. There were newspaper clippings, annotated maps, and dozens of photographs. But the most important items were a series of handwritten notes and a slim, black photo album. The notes were Silas's secret investigation, detailing the Parliament's systematic control over the town. He documented students, troublemakers, who had been framed for petty crimes and forced to leave town. He chronicled suspicious accidents that had befallen families who had challenged the Wentworth's business interests. This was bigger than 2 murders. This was a record of a shadow government that had ruled Harmony Valley with an iron fist for generations. He opened the black photo album. The first picture was a group photo, taken at what looked like a hunting lodge. It showed a group of smiling men in their prime. He saw a younger Mayor Wentworth's father. He saw a man who could only be a younger Dr. Alastair. And, standing in the back, looking uncomfortable but undeniably present, was his own father, Thomas Evans. But it was the last photo in the album that made his blood run cold. It was a candid shot of 4 high school students, laughing in the sunshine. Amelia Thompson, Clara Miller, a young, handsome Evan Wentworth, and a 4th boy, someone Brody didn't immediately recognize. On the back, in Silas's neat script, was a single, chilling question. What did the 4th friend see? A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Brody froze, his senses on high alert. He quickly shoved the album and the most critical notes into his jacket and closed the secret compartment just as the classroom door swung open. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim hall light, was old Mr. Abernathy, the man Brody saw reading the paper every morning at the daily grind. He was the school principal. He held a steaming mug in his hand, a folksy, disarming smile on his face. "Sheriff Evans. Burning the midnight oil, I see," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice deceptively casual. His eyes, however, were not smiling. They were sharp and cold as they flicked from Brody's face to the portrait of Nathaniel Preston on the wall. "Looking for something." The friendly, bumbling old man was gone. In his place stood a guardian of the Parliament's secrets. Brody was trapped, the evidence clutched in his hands, facing another one of the town's hidden monsters. The folksy charm vanished from Principal Abernathy's face like a mask dropping to the floor. The man who stood before Sheriff Brody Evans was sharp, cold, and utterly composed. He took a slow sip from his mug, his eyes never leaving Brody's, 2 chips of ice in the dim light. The evidence in Brody's jacket suddenly felt like a block of lead. "Silas was always a romantic," Abernathy said, his voice the calm, measured tone of a lecturer. He believed in a version of history that was messy, emotional. He failed to appreciate the beauty of order, the necessity of it. The order that gets teenage girls murdered? Brody shot back, his hand instinctively moving closer to his sidearm. Abernathy shook his head with a look of paternal disappointment. "You see the individual tree, Sheriff, and you miss the forest. Your father understood the forest. He knew that for a community like ours to thrive, to remain a sanctuary from the rot of the outside world, it must be carefully cultivated. Sometimes, that means pruning a branch that threatens the health of the tree. It's unpleasant, but it is essential work." He was trying to reason with him, to indoctrinate him, to appeal to the ghost of the father Brody had once worshipped. The principal took a step into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, blocking the only exit. "That box contains the sentimental scribblings of a bitter old man. It's meaningless. Give it to me, Brody. Let us put the past back where it belongs. For the good of the valley. For the good of your father's legacy." Brody knew negotiation was pointless. He was not talking to a man, he was talking to an idea, a zealot. He had to get out. Now. "The only thing that belongs in the past, Principal, is your secret club." In a single fluid motion, Brody lunged not at Abernathy, but at a tall metal shelving unit laden with old athletic trophies and dusty projectors. He shoved it with all his might. It crashed to the floor with a deafening cacophony of shattering glass and screeching metal, sending debris sliding across the linoleum, directly into Abernathy's path. The principal stumbled back, momentarily shocked by the sudden violence. It was the only opening Brody needed. He charged past the older man, shoving him aside, and burst out into the dark, silent hallway. He didn't look back. He ran, his boots pounding on the floor, the sound echoing through the empty school like a drumbeat of war. He heard Abernathy shouting behind him, his calm demeanor gone, replaced by a raw, furious command. Brody knew what it meant. The hornet's nest had been kicked. The alarm was being raised. As he sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors, he heard the faint, distant sound of a phone ringing in an office, then another. The Parliament was waking up. He burst out of the same side door he'd entered and sprinted across the dew-soaked grass of the athletic fields, melting into the darkness of the woods that bordered the school property. Behind him, he saw the headlights of a car flick on in the parking lot, then another. A moment later, he saw the cold, sweeping beam of a powerful flashlight cutting through the trees. They were mobilizing faster than he could have imagined. This was a coordinated, practiced response. A manhunt. He was now officially a fugitive in his own town. He pushed deeper into the woods, the familiar territory now a life-saving refuge. He ran blindly, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. There was only one place he could go, one person who existed outside the Parliament's web of control. He made his way through the dark forest, using the faint glow of the town lights behind him to navigate, heading for the secluded patch of wilderness that Silas Croft called home. After nearly an hour of crashing through the undergrowth, he saw it, a faint, flickering orange light ahead. He approached cautiously and found Silas's hovel, a ramshackle cabin built of scrap wood and corrugated tin. A thin curl of smoke rose from a makeshift chimney. Brody knocked on the flimsy door. It opened a crack, and Silas Croft's wary, piercing eyes peered out. Seeing Brody's disheveled state, he opened the door wider. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Sheriff," the old man rasped. "Worse," Brody said, stepping inside the small, cluttered space, which was lit by a single kerosene lamp. "I've seen the gardeners." Without preamble, Brody pulled the photo album and Silas's notes from his jacket and laid them on a rickety table. I found your research. They have the school. Abernathy is one of them. Silas nodded grimly, unsurprised. He's their ideologue, their teacher. He indoctrinates their children. His eyes fell on the black photo album. He opened it, his gnarled fingers tracing the faces in the group photo. He paused on the final picture, the one of the 4 smiling teenagers. Amelia, Clara, Evan Wentworth. His voice trailed off as he looked at the 4th boy. The back, Brody urged. You asked a question. What did the 4th friend see? Who is he, Silas? Silas stared at the face, a deep sadness filling his eyes. I should have known, he whispered, more to himself than to Brody. Of course. That's Jacob Vance. A good kid. Quiet. His father was a foreman at the old lumber mill before the Wentworths shut it down. The family packed up and left town in the middle of the night, a few weeks after Amelia disappeared. The official story was that Jacob had come down with a severe illness, and they had to move closer to a specialist. He looked up at Brody, his expression grim. They were lying, Sheriff. They were running. Jacob Vance didn't see something. He was the one who got away. The kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the cramped interior of Silas Croft's shack, a bubble of fragile light in a world that had become utterly hostile. Outside, the sounds of the manhunt echoed faintly through the woods, the distant wail of a siren, the methodical sweep of searchlights cutting across the distant ridges. The Parliament was turning over their town, looking for their rogue sheriff. Inside, Brody Evans stared at the face of Jacob Vance in the photograph, the ghost who held the key. They made the Vances run, Silas said, his voice a low rasp as he stoked the small wood-burning stove. That was one of their methods. For problems they couldn't just bury. They'd apply pressure. Mr. Vance lost his job at the mill. Their credit at the general store dried up overnight. They were ostracized. The family was choked out of this town. It was a quieter, cleaner kind of violence. But Jacob saw something first, Brody reasoned, his mind racing. Something that made them a target. He was friends with Amelia, Clara, and Evan Wentworth. He was in the inner circle. He must know what happened that summer. Then you have to find him, Silas stated, turning from the fire, his eyes intense. He is your only corroborating witness. Without him, it's your word, the word of a fugitive, against the most powerful men in the valley. That ledger you photographed is a smoking gun, but a living witness is a silver bullet. Brody knew he was right, but his resources were gone. He couldn't run a background check, couldn't access law enforcement databases. He was cut off, a ghost himself. But he wasn't entirely without allies. He had a past, a life before he'd returned to Harmony Valley. He pulled out his phone, hoping the reception was strong enough in this remote hollow. There's a man I know, Brody said, dialing a number from memory. A detective I worked with back in Philadelphia. Marcus Thorne. He's a wizard with digital records. If anyone can find a ghost, it's him. The phone rang, and a gruff, skeptical voice answered. Thorne. Marcus, it's Brody Evans. There was a pause, then a cynical chuckle. Evans. Don't tell me you're tired of chasing lost cows and want your old desk back. You sound like you're calling from the inside of a tin can. I'm in trouble, Marcus, Brody said, cutting to the chase. Deep trouble. I need a favor, a big one. And it has to be completely off the books. I need you to find someone. No questions asked. Brody could almost hear his old partner's frown. Off the books. Brody, what the hell is going on up there in paradise? It's not paradise, Brody said, his voice grim. I've kicked a hornet's nest I didn't know was here, and it runs this whole valley. I'm out of time and out of friends. Please, Marcus. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, just the faint crackle of static. Finally, Marcus sighed. All right, Evans. For old time's sake, give me the name. Brody gave him all the information he had. Jacob Vance, his approximate age, his parents' names, the year they left Harmony Valley. Marcus grunted his assent. A 20-year-old ghost. Don't hold your breath. I'll see what I can dig up. Don't call me, I'll call you. The line went dead. The wait was agonizing. For the next hour, Brody paced the small shack like a caged animal while Silas watched him, his expression unreadable. To fill the tense silence, the old historian spoke of Brody's father, not as a monster, but as a tragic figure. The Parliament is a poison, Brody, Silas said softly. It doesn't demand your soul all at once. It takes it piece by piece. First, it's a small compromise for the greater good. Then a secret kept. A blind eye turned. They offer you power, belonging, a place in the town's true history. For a man like your father, who loved this valley so deeply, that offer would have been hard to resist. Just as the first hint of gray dawn began to light the eastern sky, Brody's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "I've got your ghost," his friend's voice said, all business. "It wasn't easy. The family went completely off-grid for years. But I found him. He changed his name. Goes by Jacob Cole now. He's living in Oakhaven, about a 2-hour drive west of you. Owns a small carpentry business. Keeps to himself. No criminal record. He's been hiding in plain sight." Relief washed over Brody, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He had a location. A destination. "Marcus, I owe you." "Yeah, you do," Thorne replied. "Listen, Brody, the digital trail around this guy is weird. It's too clean. Almost like someone scrubbed it for him. Be careful. This feels wrong. Watch your back." After the call, a new energy filled the shack. The mission was clear. "I have to go," Brody said to Silas. "I have to get to him before they do." "You can't go looking like the sheriff of Harmony Valley," Silas said. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a worn flannel shirt, a pair of faded jeans, and a grease-stained baseball cap. "And you can't take your truck. They'll have a bolo out on it by now." He led Brody out the back of the shack to a dilapidated shed. Inside, under a dusty tarp, was a rusty, dented, mud-colored pickup truck from the 1980s. "She ain't pretty," Silas said, handing him a key. "But she runs, and she's never been registered. A true ghost. Just like you." Dressed in his new disguise, Brody got behind the wheel of the old truck. He was no longer Sheriff Evans. He was just a man on a desperate mission. As he turned the key and the engine sputtered to life, Silas leaned in the window. "Be careful, son," the old man warned. "You're going to find Jacob Vance. But remember, a man who has been running for 20 years might not want to be found. He might be more afraid of you than he is of them." Brody nodded, the truth of the words settling in. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the shack, driving slowly down a hidden dirt track that led back to the main road. As he merged into the light morning traffic, leaving Harmony Valley in his rearview mirror, he felt the full weight of his new reality. He was a fugitive, chasing a ghost, hunted by monsters who wore the faces of his friends and family. And he was driving straight into the heart of the unknown. The rusty pickup truck rattled along the 2-lane highway, a ghost moving through the misty Appalachian dawn. Behind the wheel, Brody Evans felt like a stranger in his own skin. The worn flannel shirt felt rough against his neck, and the brim of the greasy baseball cap cast a shadow over a face that was no longer that of a sheriff, but of a fugitive. With every mile that separated him from Harmony Valley, the sense of being hunted grew sharper. He checked the rearview mirror constantly, his eyes scanning for the telltale shape of a police cruiser or the dark sedans favored by men like Wentworth. Every passing car was a potential threat, every small town a possible trap. His old life, his identity, had been burned away in the last 48 hours, leaving only the raw, singular mission: find Jacob Vance. He was not just a witness, he was a time capsule, a living record of the truth, sealed shut by 20 years of fear. Brody wondered what kind of man he would find. Would he be broken by what he'd seen? Or would he have managed to build a new life on the ashes of his old one? Silas's warning echoed in his mind. A man who has been running for 20 years might not want to be found. After 2 hours of tense, focused driving, he saw the sign, "Welcome to Oakhaven." The town was the antithesis of Harmony Valley. There were no quaint town squares or historic mansions. Oakhaven was a working town, gritty and unpretentious, with a lumber mill on its outskirts and a main street lined with practical storefronts, a hardware store, a laundromat, a diner with a buzzing neon sign. It was the perfect place to disappear, a town where people were more concerned with making a living than with who your grandfather was. It was a town without ghosts. Brody found the address Marcus Thorne had given him in a quiet, residential neighborhood of small, identical houses. A simple sign in the yard read, "Cole's Custom Carpentry," with a workshop set up in a large, detached garage. This was it. Brody didn't approach immediately. He parked his truck at the end of the street, in the shade of a large oak tree, and he watched. He was a detective again, falling back on the patience and discipline he'd learned in Philadelphia. A direct approach was a fool's errand. He needed to understand the terrain, to understand his target. 4 hours, he sat and observed. He saw a man emerge from the workshop, his bearing weary but strong. He was in his late 30s, with dark, thinning hair and a perpetual frown etched onto his face. He was covered in a fine layer of sawdust, and he moved with the efficient, no-nonsense grace of a man who works with his hands. He loaded a finished cabinet into the back of a customer's truck, his conversation brief and his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. Brody saw it then, a nervous habit, a constant glance over the shoulder, the way his body tensed whenever a car drove by too slowly. This was Jacob Vance. He had changed his name, but he had never escaped the prison of his past. Brody waited until the end of the day, when the sun was low in the sky and the last customer had departed. He watched Jacob lock up the workshop and walk toward the small house. His shoulders were slumped, the exhaustion of his day compounded by the weight of 2 decades of vigilance. Now was the time. Brody got out of his truck and approached the house, his heart a steady, heavy drum in his chest. He intercepted Jacob just as he was about to put his key in the front door. "Mr. Cole," Brody said, his voice calm and low. Jacob froze, his whole body going rigid. He didn't turn around. "Workshop's closed," he said, his voice flat and defensive. "I'm not a customer," Brody continued, taking a careful step closer. "I just need a moment of your time. My name is Brody Evans. I'm from a small town a couple hours east of here." Jacob still didn't move. "Never heard of it. I can't help you." "I think you can," Brody said softly. "Because I don't think your name is Cole. I think it's Vance. Jacob Vance. From Harmony Valley." At the sound of his real name, Jacob flinched as if struck. He slowly turned, and Brody saw the face of a man who had just seen a ghost. His eyes were wide with a primal, cornered animal terror. "I don't know who you're talking about," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You have the wrong person. Please, just leave." He fumbled with his keys, desperate to get inside, to lock the door and pretend this wasn't happening. "We need to talk about Amelia Thompson," Brody pressed, his voice gentle but firm. "And Clara Miller." "No," Jacob said, shaking his head, his voice cracking. "No. I don't know anything. I wasn't there. I don't know anything." He finally got the key in the lock and was about to bolt inside and slam the door. "Jacob, wait," Brody said, his voice sharp with urgency. He pulled a photograph from his jacket, the faded image of 4 smiling teenagers, immortalized in a moment of lost innocence. He held it out. "I know you were there. I know you were their friend. And I know you saw what happened to them." Jacob's eyes fell upon the photograph. He stopped, his hand frozen on the doorknob. The defensive mask shattered, replaced by a wave of raw, unfiltered anguish. The carefully constructed walls of his new life crumbled in an instant, and he stared at the image of his younger self, of the girl he couldn't save, and of the secret he had carried alone, in silence, for 20 long years. The photograph was a key, unlocking a door that Jacob Vance had kept sealed for 2 decades. The image of his smiling, carefree youth, standing next to friends who were now ghosts, shattered his composure. The fear that had been his constant companion for 20 years was momentarily overwhelmed by a tidal wave of grief. He sagged against the doorframe, the fight draining out of him, and with a gesture of utter defeat, he waved Sheriff Brody Evans inside. He led Brody not into a living room, but into a stark, sparsely furnished kitchen. The house felt less like a home and more like a long-term hiding place, stripped of personal effects, as if its occupant was ready to flee at a moment's notice. Jacob collapsed into a chair at a small wooden table, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Brody stood by, giving him the space to let the dam of emotion finally break. He placed the photograph on the table, a silent testament to their shared past. After a long time, Jacob's sobs subsided. He took a ragged breath and looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "You don't know what you've done," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Coming here. Finding me. You've just rung the dinner bell for them. They're already hunting me, Jacob," Brody said quietly, sitting down opposite him. "I found her body. I found their ledger. I know about the Parliament." He paused, the next words catching in his throat. "I know my father was one of them." This revelation seemed to shock Jacob out of his fear. He stared at Brody, seeing not a threat, but another victim. "Your father," he breathed. "He was there. That night. He was the one who—" "Tell me," Brody urged, his voice low and steady. "Tell me what you saw." And so, the story came pouring out, a torrent of memory that had been poisoning Jacob from the inside for half his life. He spoke of that summer, of the secret romance between Evan Wentworth and Amelia Thompson. Evan, suffocating under the weight of his family's expectations, had found in Amelia a glimpse of a different life. He had confessed everything to her, the Parliament, their secrets, their control over the town. Their plan was to run away together after graduation. But someone found out. They were supposed to meet at the old Miller's Bridge to say goodbye, Jacob said, his eyes distant, lost in the memory. Evan was late. Amelia was there waiting. I was fishing downstream, hidden by the reeds. I was going to surprise them, say my own goodbye. His voice broke. Then a car pulled up. Not Evans. It was his father, the mayor, and your father, the sheriff. They got out, and they weren't smiling. Jacob described the confrontation. They knew about the plan to run away. Mayor Wentworth was furious, calling Amelia a gold-digging tramp who was trying to poison his son. Sheriff Evans was colder, more calculating, telling her she was making a terrible mistake that would have consequences for everyone. Amelia didn't back down, Jacob recalled, a flicker of admiration in his voice. She was brave. She told them she knew all their secrets. She threatened to go to the state police, to expose everything. That's when it happened. Wentworth lunged at her, trying to grab her. She fought back, scratched his face. He lost control. He shoved her, hard. Her head hit the stone abutment of the bridge. Jacob squeezed his eyes shut. She just fell. She didn't get back up. Brody felt the air turn to ice in his lungs. This was it. The ugly, brutal truth. Evan arrived then, Jacob continued, his voice barely a whisper. He saw what his father had done. He just started screaming. But your father, Sheriff Evans, he was like stone. He took control. He checked Amelia's pulse. Then he looked at Wentworth and said, "She's gone. Now we fix this." He was the one who put her body in the trunk of their car. He was the one who grabbed a hysterical Evan and told him that if he ever spoke a word of this, he would be next. They were cleaning it up, like it was a mess someone had spilled on the floor. "And they saw you?" Brody asked. Jacob shook his head. "I don't think so. Not for sure. But I ran. I ran all the way home, and that night, my dad came into my room. He was pale as a ghost. He said we were leaving. That Mr. Wentworth had offered him a new job, far away. A job he couldn't refuse. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat. We left before the sun came up. I never looked back." The confession hung in the air, a story of power, cruelty, and profound betrayal. Brody finally understood the cold efficiency of the Parliament. They hadn't just murdered a girl, they had erased her, silenced a witness, and buried the truth under 20 years of fear. He looked at the broken man in front of him. "Jacob," he said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised him. "We can end this. Together. Your testimony, the ledger, we can burn it all down." Jacob looked up, a wild, terrified hope warring with a lifetime of fear in his eyes. "You think we can win? Against them?" "I think we have to try," Brody said. As the words left his mouth, a beam of light swept across the kitchen window, momentarily illuminating the room before moving on. Both men froze. Brody slowly rose and peered through the blinds. His blood ran cold. Parked under a streetlight at the end of the block, silent and patient, was a dark, immaculate sedan. It was the same make and model as the car Mayor Wentworth drove. They hadn't followed him. They had been waiting for him. They hadn't just been hunting him, they had been tracking him, letting him lead them straight to the one loose end they'd left 20 years ago. The dinner bell had been rung, and the wolves were at the door. The sight of the dark sedan, parked like a vulture under the distant streetlight, sucked all the air from the room. It was an elegant, expensive car, utterly out of place in this neighborhood of working-class homes, and it radiated a quiet, predatory menace. 20 years of running had ended here, on this quiet street in Oak Haven. The past hadn't just caught up with Jacob Vance, it had cornered him. He stumbled back from the window, his face a mask of pure terror, a low moan escaping his lips. "It's them," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh God, it's them. They found me. They followed you." "No," Brody said, his mind racing, his tactical instincts taking over. He pulled Jacob away from the window, his voice a low, commanding whisper. "They didn't follow me. They were waiting. They knew I'd find you. They've been playing me this whole time." The realization was a cold stone in his gut. He had thought he was the hunter, but he had been the hunting dog, leading the masters straight to their prey. "Jacob, listen to me. Panic is what they want. We are not going to give it to them." Brody moved through the small house, his movements swift and silent. He peered through the edge of another window, confirming the situation. One car. At least 2 men inside, he guessed, maybe more. They weren't storming the house. This wasn't an arrest. It was a siege. They would wait, let the fear build, and choose their moment to move in and quietly eliminate their 2 problems. "They'll come in the dead of night," Brody assessed, his voice hardening. "No witnesses. We can't stay here." There's no way out, Jacob hissed, his eyes darting around the room as if the walls were closing in. They're watching the front door. Then we don't use the front door, Brody countered. He looked toward the back of the house. Your workshop. Is there another way out of it? A back door? A window? Jacob's eyes lit with a flicker of understanding. There's a loading door in the back, for bringing in lumber. It opens onto the alley. Good, Brody said. The gears were turning. They had a potential exit. Now they needed a diversion. His eyes swept the kitchen, then landed on Jacob. You're a carpenter. You have a workshop full of tools, chemicals, scrap wood. Of course, Jacob stammered. Solvents, varnishes, sawdust everywhere. A plan, desperate and dangerous, began to form in Brody's mind. We're going to make some noise, he said. He led Jacob out the back door of the house and into the sprawling, cluttered workshop. The air was thick with the scent of pine and sawdust. Find me a metal trash can, oily rags, and some of your most flammable wood finish, Brody ordered. Jacob, spurred to action by Brody's confidence, moved with a newfound purpose. They worked quickly in the dim light of the workshop. Brody placed the metal barrel under a window on the side of the building facing the street, the one most visible to the men in the sedan. He filled it with the rags and doused them with the solvent, the acrid smell filling the space. It was a controlled bomb of smoke and light. When I light this, they'll come to investigate the fire, Brody explained, keeping his voice low. It will draw them to this side of the building. That's when we go. Out the back loading door, down the alley, and away from the street. Where's your vehicle? A work van, Jacob said. I park it in the alley, behind the shop. Perfect, Brody breathed. Get the keys. Be ready to move fast, and stay quiet. Brody struck a match. He held it for a moment, the small flame a beacon of defiance in the darkness. He looked at Jacob, whose face was a mixture of terror and resolve. Ready. Jacob gave a single, jerky nod. Brody tossed the match into the barrel. The solvent ignited with a deafening whoosh, a column of bright orange flame roaring to life, casting frantic, dancing shadows across the workshop. Thick, black smoke began to pour from the open window. Within seconds, they heard shouted voices from the street, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and running footsteps on the pavement. The diversion was working. Now, Brody yelled. He and Jacob ran to the back of the workshop, raised the heavy loading door just enough to slip under, and melted into the darkness of the alley. They moved low and fast, hugging the shadows of fences and overgrown bushes. They could hear the men shouting in the front, their attention completely focused on the fire. They reached Jacob's van, a beat-up, windowless vehicle with Cole's Custom Carpentry lettered on the side. Jacob fumbled with the keys, his hand shaking, but the lock finally clicked. They slid inside, Brody taking the driver's seat. He didn't turn on the headlights. With the engine off, he let the van roll silently down the alley's gentle slope until they reached the cross street at the far end of the block, well away from the flashing lights that were now visible from a responding fire truck. Only then did he turn the key, the engine rumbling to life. He pulled onto the street and drove away, calmly, just another work van heading home after a long day. They drove in silence for miles, leaving Oakhaven and its newfound dangers behind them. Jacob stared out the passenger window, the adrenaline slowly leaving him, replaced by a profound, trembling exhaustion. Where do we go? He finally asked, his voice fragile. They know who I am. They know what I look like. They'll find us again. Brody gripped the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. You're right, he said, his voice a low, hard growl. They will. As long as we're running. We've been playing defense, Jacob. Reacting. It's time to go on offense. Offense? What does that mean? Jacob asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. It means we stop running from the evidence and we start going after it, Brody said. I have pictures of their ledger, but a good lawyer could argue they're fakes. We need the real thing. The original book. And there's only one person who would be arrogant enough to keep it in his own home. Brody made a sharp turn, heading not west into deeper anonymity, but east, back the way he came. We're going to get it. Jacob stared at him, his eyes wide with horror and a dawning insane sense of hope. Get it from who? Where are we going? We're going back, Brody said, his voice cold as steel. Back to Harmony Valley. We're going to Mayor Wentworth's house, and we're going to steal his book of secrets. The beat-up work van sped eastward through the night, a tiny, anonymous capsule of rebellion moving against the tide of its own fear. For the first 20 minutes, Jacob Vance was a coiled spring of panic, his knuckles white as he gripped the dashboard, his breathing shallow. This is suicide, you know that? He finally burst out, his voice thin and strained. Going back there? We're driving right into the fire. The fire is everywhere, Jacob, Brody said, his eyes fixed on the road, his tone hard and certain. You've been living with the smoke for 20 years. They have a national reach. We could drive to California, and they would eventually find us. We'd spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, just like you have been. The only way we get to stop looking is if we make them stop looking. For good. By breaking into the house of the most powerful man in the valley? Jacob retorted, his voice dripping with terrified sarcasm. That's not a plan, it's a death wish. It's the only plan we have, Brody countered, his voice softening slightly. He glanced at the man beside him, a man whose life had been stolen. We need the original ledger. That book is their history, their covenant. It's proof that what happened to Amelia wasn't a single act, but a pattern. It's the one thing that can bring in a higher authority, one that Wentworth can't control. With that book, we don't just get justice for Amelia. We get your life back. The words hung in the air. Get your life back. It was a concept so foreign to Jacob that he had no response. He slumped back in his seat, the fire of his panic dimming to the embers of a reluctant, terrifying hope. They didn't drive straight into Harmony Valley. That would be foolish. Brody, using his intimate knowledge of the surrounding mountains, took a series of winding back roads. He drove them to a place from his own past, an old, abandoned Forest Service cabin he and his father had used on hunting trips years ago. It was remote, dilapidated, and completely off the grid. It was the perfect place to become ghosts. They hid the van in a thicket of pine trees and, under the cover of darkness, made the cabin their temporary command post. Inside, with a single flashlight providing a pool of light on the dusty floor, Brody began to plan. He took a piece of charcoal from the cold fireplace and started sketching the layout of the Wentworth estate on a wooden board, all from memory. The main house, the long driveway, the location of the study. I confronted him in his study, Brody explained, pointing to a square on his makeshift map. It's on the ground floor, back of the house, overlooking the gardens. It's where he'd keep the ledger. It has to be in a safe. A modern safe in a historic house? Jacob mused, his carpenter's mind kicking into gear. He can't just put a heavy floor safe on a 100-year-old oak floor. The joists wouldn't support it. He'd have to have it reinforced. How? Brody asked, intrigued. From the basement, Jacob said, his voice gaining confidence as he stepped onto familiar professional ground. He'd have a steel or concrete support built directly beneath it. If we can find that support in the basement, we'll know exactly where the safe is in the room above. We might not have to crack the door. Maybe we can cut through the floor from below and get at the base of the safe. It's often the weakest point. A slow smile spread across Brody's face. Jacob wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a partner. Can you do that? With the right tools, yeah, Jacob said. Most of what I'd need is in my van. A core drill, a reciprocating saw, a small pry bar. The plan began to solidify. It was audacious, bordering on insane, but it had a sliver of a chance. They wouldn't go in through the front door. They wouldn't even go through a window. They would go in through the basement, the foundation of the house, and cut their way up through the floor, right into the heart of the mayor's sanctum. They spent the rest of the day preparing, turning the work van into their arsenal. They synchronized their watches. They studied the map until they knew it by heart. As dusk fell, a profound quiet settled over the two men. They were no longer a fugitive and a witness. They were a team, bound by a shared enemy and a desperate gamble. As true darkness enveloped the valley, they changed into dark clothes. The time had come. They left the silent cabin and hiked through the woods to a ridge that overlooked the Wentworth estate. The mansion was ablaze with lights, a jewel of corrupt power nestled in the dark hills. It looked impenetrable, untouchable. Brody turned to Jacob, his face a grim, determined mask in the moonlight. He passed him a small, powerful drill. There's no turning back after this, Brody said, his voice a low whisper. Jacob took the drill, its weight a solid, reassuring presence in his trembling hands. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't running away from his fear. He was running toward it. He looked at the mansion, then at Brody, and gave a single, firm nod. I know, he said, his voice steady. Let's go get my life back. The descent from the wooded ridge was a slow, agonizing crawl through a world of shadows and whispers. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot, every rustle of leaves in the night breeze like an approaching footstep. Brody Evans and Jacob Vance moved with the practiced stealth of predators, their bodies low to the ground, their senses straining in the darkness. The Wentworth mansion loomed larger and larger, not as a home, but as a fortress, its lit windows like the unblinking eyes of a dragon guarding its treasure. They reached the high stone wall that marked the edge of the property. It was an old wall, built for show more than for security. Jacob, with a carpenter's eye, found a section where the mortar had crumbled, offering just enough of a handhold. Brody went first, pulling himself over the top and dropping silently onto the manicured lawn on the other side. He helped Jacob over, and the two men were now in enemy territory. They moved in a crouch, using the sculpted hedges and ornamental trees as cover, making their way to the back of the mansion, to the darkness that lay beyond the reach of the patio lights. Brody had remembered a detail from his one and only visit, a set of old angled cellar doors, nearly hidden by overgrown ivy. It was a relic from a time when coal was delivered to the basement, long since abandoned. Jacob knelt beside it, pulling a slim pry bar and a can of oil from his tool bag. He worked with a surgeon's precision, oiling the ancient hinges, slowly and carefully working the tip of the bar into the seam. For a full 10 minutes, the only sounds were the soft scrape of metal on metal and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. With a final, muted groan of protest, the lock gave way. They lifted the heavy wooden door and slipped into the abyss, pulling it shut behind them. The air that greeted them was cold and damp, thick with the smell of earth and decay. Using a small, shielded flashlight, they navigated the labyrinthine basement. It was a crypt of forgotten things, furniture shrouded in white cloths like sleeping ghosts, dusty racks of wine bottles, and in the center of it all, a massive, octopus-like furnace that seemed to breathe in the darkness. They made their way to the area directly beneath the study. As Jacob had predicted, a section of the stone foundation had been replaced with a large, square concrete platform, reinforced with steel I-beams. It was the anchor for the safe above. "This is it," Jacob whispered, his voice filled with a nervous excitement. "Right here." Now came the most dangerous part. Jacob unpacked his tools, his movements economical and sure. He chose a drill bit designed for making clean, quiet pilot holes. The low whir of the battery-powered drill was a terrifying intrusion into the silence of the house. Brody stood guard, his back to Jacob, his gaze fixed on the wooden ceiling above, listening. He could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere in the house, a slow, steady countdown to their discovery. Jacob worked for what felt like an eternity. He drilled a series of holes, then used a fine-toothed reciprocating saw to connect them, the blade's sharp buzz muffled as best it could be by a heavy blanket they'd found. Sawdust rained down on them, a fine pale snow in the flashlight's beam. Finally, with a soft crack, a large, square section of the subfloor came loose. A dark, gaping hole now led directly into the mayor's study. Brody went first. He handed his flashlight to Jacob and pulled himself up into the darkness. He landed in a silent crouch behind the mayor's massive mahogany desk. The room was just as he remembered it, filled with the scent of leather and power. He reached down and helped Jacob through the opening. They were in. The safe was where he'd expected, a formidable block of black steel disguised behind a large oil painting of the mayor's father. Brody swung the painting aside. Now for the combination. He thought of Wentworth's arrogance, his obsession with legacy. On the desk was a silver-framed photograph of the mayor and his son. An inscription read, "Like father, like son, EST 1968. Brody's gut told him it was too obvious. His eyes scanned the room and landed on the painting of Elias Wentworth. On the brass plaque below the portrait were two dates, the years of the man's birth and death. An arrogant son wouldn't use his own birth year. He would use his father's, the start of the dynasty he'd inherited. Brody turned the dial. Right to 19. Left to 34. Right to 98. He held his breath and pulled the handle. With a soft, satisfying thunk, the heavy door swung open. And there it was. Nestled amongst stock certificates and jewelry boxes was the ledger, old, black, and filled with a history of evil. Brody reached in, his fingers closing around the worn leather cover. He had it. It was in that moment of triumph that he heard it. A soft, distinct sound from the floor above. A creak. Followed by another. Then, the faint, heavy tread of footsteps crossing a hardwood floor. Someone was awake. The footsteps moved from above them toward the main part of the house. Brody and Jacob froze, their eyes locked in shared panic. The footsteps reached the grand staircase. And then, slowly, deliberately, they began to descend. The master of the house was coming down, and they were trapped in the heart of his den with his most precious secret in their hands. The footsteps stopped. In the suffocating silence of the study, the sound of the doorknob turning was as loud as a thunderclap. Brody Evans instinctively pushed Jacob Vance behind him, raising the heavy ledger like a shield, his body tensed for a fight. The door swung inward. Mayor Richard Wentworth stood there, dressed in a silk robe, a glass of brandy in his hand. For a split second, he looked merely annoyed at the intrusion. Then his eyes took in the scene, the open safe, the hole in his priceless oak floor, and the two intruders, one the rogue sheriff, the other a ghost from 20 years ago. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound of final, sharp punctuation mark on the end of his ordered world. Wentworth's face, a mask of aristocratic calm just moments before, contorted into a snarl of pure, unrestrained fury. But his voice, when it came, was chillingly soft. "Well," he breathed, a predatory smile touching his lips. "The vermin have found their way into the pantry. I should have had you both exterminated in Oakhaven." "It's over, Wentworth," Brody said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the swirling tension. "I have the book. I have the witness. Your little club is finished." "You have nothing," the mayor spat, taking a step into the room. He was looking past Brody, his eyes locking on Jacob with a look of utter contempt. "A delusional runaway and a disgraced cop. Who will believe you?" It was then that Jacob, who had been trembling behind Brody, took a shaky step forward. 20 years of terror had led to this moment, to this room, to this man. He looked the mayor in the eye. "I will," Jacob said, his voice wavering but clear. "I'll tell them. I'll tell them everything." "You'll tell them what, boy?" Wentworth sneered. "Some fantasy you concocted after you ran away like a coward?" "I'll tell them I was at Miller's Bridge that night," Jacob said, his voice growing stronger with every word, the truth of fire burning away the fear. "I'll tell them I saw you shove Amelia. I saw her head hit the stone. I saw you and Sheriff Evans put her in your trunk while your own son was screaming. I saw everything." The direct accusation, so long buried, finally spoken aloud, seemed to physically wound the mayor. His face went pale with rage. "You lie. Do I?" Jacob pressed, emboldened. "I saw the scratch she left on your face. The one you told everyone came from a rose bush in the garden." Wentworth lunged for the desk, yanking open the top drawer and pulling out a heavy, silver-plated revolver. "I should have had your whole family dealt with," he roared, leveling the gun at Jacob. "Father, what's going on?" A new voice cut through the chaos. Richard Wentworth Jr. stood in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. He was holding a pistol of his own, his face a confused mixture of alarm and dawning horror. "Stay out of this, Richard," his father commanded. "Help me clean up this mess." The study had become a powder keg. Brody drew his own service weapon, the one he hadn't turned in, its familiar weight a grim comfort. It was a four-way standoff, a tangled knot of old sins and new desperation. "Put the gun down, Mayor," Brody said, his aim steady. "There's no way out of this. There's always a way out." Wentworth yelled, his eyes wild. It was at that moment that a new figure appeared in the doorway behind Richard Jr., a man who looked like a ghost, gaunt and pale, with haunted, hollow eyes and dressed in a rumpled pajama shirt. He was a whisper of the handsome boy from the photograph. "He's right, Father," the man said, his voice a dry, unused rasp. "He's telling the truth." Mayor Wentworth froze, his head snapping toward the door. "Evan," he breathed, the name a curse on his lips. Evan Wentworth, the broken prince of Harmony Valley, stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on his father. "You told me she ran away," he whispered, his voice trembling with a lifetime of grief and gaslit confusion. "You told me she left me. But he's right. I remember screaming. I remember her on the ground. You took her from me." The accusation, from his own broken son, was the final blow. The mayor's entire world, his legacy, his control, was crumbling to dust before his eyes. "I did it for you!" Wentworth shrieked, his composure utterly shattered. He was no longer a mayor or a patriarch. He was a cornered animal. "I did it for this family. For our name." He turned his rage on the source of his ruin, swinging the gun from Jacob towards his own son, Evan. "You were always weak." Brody moved, instinctively lunging to shove Evan out of the line of fire. Richard Jr., seeing his father about to shoot his brother, shouted no, and took a step forward. It was a chaotic, desperate ballet of violence. In the confusion, with Brody off balance and everyone's attention on Evan, Mayor Wentworth saw his chance. He redirected his aim, not at his son, not at the witness, but at the true threat. He aimed his revolver straight at Brody Evans. A single, deafening gunshot exploded in the enclosed space, a flash of fire and a roar that shook the very foundations of the house. The smell of cordite filled the air. Then, silence. The gunshot was a deafening, final roar. In the split second that followed the flash, as the smell of burnt gunpowder filled the opulent study, Sheriff Brody Evans braced for an impact that never came. He saw not the barrel of Mayor Wentworth's gun, but a sudden, desperate blur of motion. Evan Wentworth, the ghost who had haunted this house for 20 years, had lunged forward with a surprising final burst of clarity. He had thrown himself in front of Brody, not as a prince protecting his kingdom, but as a man finally standing up to the father who had destroyed him. The bullet struck Evan high in the chest, the impact throwing him backward with a sickening thud. He collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, a dark, rapidly spreading stain blossoming on his pajama shirt. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen in a tableau of horror. Mayor Wentworth stared at his fallen son, the smoking revolver still clutched in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief. Richard Jr. looked on, his own weapon forgotten, his mouth agape. That single heartbeat was all Brody needed. The cop inside him, the one forged in the streets of Philadelphia and honed by years of discipline, took over. He kicked out, his boot connecting solidly with the mayor's wrist. The revolver clattered to the floor. In the same motion, Brody slammed Wentworth against his own mahogany desk, twisting his arm behind his back. "Don't move," he snarled, his voice the very definition of command. "Call 911, he yelled at Richard Jr., who was still frozen in shock. "Tell them there's been a shooting. Now." The younger Wentworth, finally jolted into action, fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. Brody kicked both guns away and turned his attention to Evan. Jacob was already there, his face pale, ripping a piece of his shirt to press against the wound. "Hold on," Jacob was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "Just hold on." Evan's eyes were open, unfocused, a faint, sad smile on his lips. He had finally done something that mattered. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Brody kept his knee pressed into the back of the subdued and suddenly silent mayor, his mind racing. He still had the ledger clutched in his hand. The proof. He could hear the distant, approaching wail of sirens. But whose sirens? The local police, controlled by the parliament? Or something else? He was still a fugitive, and this was still a house of wolves. The first car to screech up the long driveway was not a Harmony Valley cruiser. It was a dark blue state police vehicle, followed immediately by two more. Troopers in crisp gray uniforms poured out, their movements tactical and efficient, their presence an immediate and overwhelming shift in the balance of power. They stormed the house, led by a tall, grim-faced captain who took in the surreal scene in the study with a single sweeping glance. "State police," the captain boomed. "Everyone drop your weapons." "My weapon is on the floor," Brody said, his voice steady, not releasing his hold on the mayor. "I'm Sheriff Brody Evans. This is Mayor Richard Wentworth. I'm placing him under arrest for the murder of Amelia Thompson 20 years ago, and for the attempted murder of myself and his son, Evan Wentworth, tonight." The captain's eyes narrowed, recognizing Brody from the bolo that had undoubtedly been issued. He saw the ledger in Brody's hand, the bleeding man on the floor, the broken witness, and the shattered mayor. He saw a story far more complex than a simple fugitive alert. "Secure him," the captain ordered his men, gesturing to the mayor. As the troopers cuffed a now catatonic Richard Wentworth, another trooper approached Brody cautiously. "Sir, I need you to release the suspect and put your hands up." Brody slowly stood, releasing the mayor, and raised his hands. He was no longer in control, and a profound, weary relief washed over him. Paramedics rushed in, pushing past the officers to work on Evan. As they wheeled him out, his life hanging by a thread, Brody caught Jacob's eye. A silent understanding passed between them. They had done it. They had survived. A young trooper began to read Brody his rights, but the captain held up a hand. "Hold on, son." He walked over to Brody. "We got an interesting call about an hour ago," the captain said, his voice a low rumble. "From a Deputy Mark Riley. Said his sheriff had uncovered a town-wide conspiracy, was being hunted by the most powerful men in the valley, and was likely walking into a trap at this very address. Said he didn't know who else to call. That boy's either crazy, or he's the only honest cop in this whole damn county." The captain looked from Brody to the ledger, then back again. "Right now, I'm leaning toward the latter. You're not under arrest, Sheriff. But you and I are going to have a very long talk." Brody finally let himself breathe. He watched as the state police took control of the scene, a methodical and impartial force of justice sweeping through the corrupt heart of his town. They took Richard Jr. for questioning. They secured the house as a crime scene. They took the ledger and placed it into an evidence bag, its dark secrets now the property of the law. The long night was over. The dark secret of Harmony Valley was finally, irrevocably, out in the open. Brody stood on the manicured lawn, a blanket draped over his shoulders, and watched the sun begin to rise over the mountains, its clean, honest light washing over a valley that would never be the same. Dawn broke over Harmony Valley, not with the gentle pastels of a peaceful morning, but with the stark, flashing blue and red lights of justice. The Wentworth Mansion, once the unassailable fortress of the town's ruling dynasty, was now just a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, its secrets being methodically disassembled by the impartial hands of the state police. For Sheriff Brody Evans, the night's adrenaline had given way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He sat in his own office, now a temporary command post for the state investigation, the familiar space feeling alien, as if he were seeing it for the first time. He spent the next few hours giving a formal statement to Captain Hayes, the stoic, no-nonsense commander of the state police unit. Brody recounted everything, from Caleb Miller's panicked phone call to the gunshot in the mayor's study. He detailed Silas Croft's story, the discovery of the ledger, and Jacob Vance's harrowing testimony. When he was done, he slid the photos he'd taken of the ledger pages from his phone to the captain's computer. Hayes reviewed the evidence, his expression grim. "You've been through hell, Sheriff," the captain said, a note of respect in his voice. "But you did a damn fine job. Now, let us handle the cleanup." And the cleanup began. Armed with the names from the ledger and the authority of the state, the dominoes began to fall with breathtaking speed. Brody listened as the radio traffic painted a picture of a town being lanced of a century-old infection. Dr. Alistair was arrested during his morning rounds at the clinic, his renowned bedside manner vanishing into a mask of cold fury. Principal Abernathy was taken from his office at the high school, his arrest a quiet, dignified affair that did nothing to lessen the shock that rippled through his staff. Judge Preston, seeing the inevitable, surrendered himself without incident. The pillars of the community, the men who had shaped Harmony Valley in their own twisted image, were falling one by one. Brody found Jacob Vance in a small interview room, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. The terror that had been etched onto his face for 20 years was gone, replaced by a quiet, fragile sense of disbelief. "It's really happening," Jacob said, looking at Brody. "It's really over." "It's the beginning," Brody corrected him gently. "You're a protected witness now, Jacob. They'll take care of you. All you have to do is what you've been waiting 20 years to do, tell the truth." A state trooper came to escort Jacob to a safe house, but before he left, he turned to Brody. "Thank you," he said, the words heavy with unspoken emotion. "You gave me my life back." As the day wore on, a strange new reality settled over Harmony Valley. The town buzzed with whispers, rumors, and a dawning, horrified understanding. The secret was out, and the idyllic image the town held of itself was shattered forever. This was now a place of reckoning. With the main threat neutralized, Brody knew there was one last ghost he had to face alone. He drove to his father's house on Elm Street. The silence within was profound. He walked into the study and stood before the mantel, looking at the photograph of his father, the smiling, confident lawman. He opened the desk drawer and looked at the owl tie pin nestled in its velvet box. There was no rage left in him, only a vast, aching sadness. His father had not been a simple monster. He was a man who had made a series of terrible choices, all in the name of a corrupt, twisted ideal of order. A good man who had allowed a poison to enter his soul. Brody picked up the tie pin, not with disgust, but with a sense of grim duty. He placed it in an evidence bag he'd brought from the station, sealing it with a label, T. Evans. He would not hide the truth, not even for his own father. His legacy would not be one of secrets and lies. It would be one of truth, however painful. In that moment, he felt the weight of his father's shadow finally begin to lift. His phone rang, startling him from his reverie. It was his old friend from Philadelphia, Detective Marcus Thorne. "Just got off the phone with the state boys watching your witness, Caleb Miller," Marcus said. "He's awake, stable, and talking. Gave them a full statement." "That's great news," Brody said, a genuine wave of relief washing over him. "There's more," Marcus continued. He remembered something. Something his sister, Clara, told him right before she disappeared. She was scared. She told him she had an insurance policy, a journal where she'd written down everything she suspected about the Parliament and what happened to Amelia. She made him promise that if anything happened to her, he would find it. Brody felt a new surge of purpose. "Did she say where it was?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "She told him to look under the weeping angel. Caleb has no idea what it means, but he said you might." Brody's mind raced. The weeping angel. It wasn't a riddle. It was a place. The oldest, most ornate gravestone in the Harmony Valley Cemetery, a massive, sorrowful angel marking the plot of the town's first mayor, Nathaniel Preston. Clara Miller hadn't just run away. She had left behind one final, damning piece of the puzzle. The story wasn't quite over yet. There was one last secret to unearth. The machine of state justice was now in motion, a vast and impersonal force grinding down the foundations of the Parliament's empire. But for Sheriff Brody Evans, one piece of the puzzle remained, a personal ghost that the law alone could not put to rest. Clara Miller. Her fate was still an open question, a loose thread in the brutal tapestry he had uncovered. Caleb's words pointed him to the one place in Harmony Valley where the past was not just remembered, but enshrined in stone, the cemetery. He drove there in the late afternoon, under a sky the color of slate. A cool, damp wind whispered through the ancient cedar and oak trees that stood guard over the town's dead. The Harmony Valley Cemetery was a history book in its own right, its rolling hills a map of the town's hierarchy. On the lower slopes lay the simple, modest stones of farmers and laborers. On the highest hill, with the best view of the valley they had once ruled, were the grand, imposing mausoleums and monuments of the founding families. Wentworth, Blackwood, Preston. Brody found the Preston family plot easily. It was dominated by a massive, sorrowful statue of a weeping angel, its stone face buried in its hands, its vast wings protectively shielding the graves of generations of corrupt patriarchs. The statue was a masterpiece of grief, a beautiful lie carved in granite. Brody walked around the base, his hand trailing over the cold, moss-dusted stone. He looked for anything out of place, a loose block, a hidden seam. On the back of the monument, away from the path, half hidden by a thorny rose bush, he found it. A small, barely noticeable carving, no bigger than his thumb. It was an owl, its wings spread wide. It was a maker's mark, a quiet signature of the Parliament's ownership, even in death. He pressed his thumb firmly into the center of the carving. With a soft, grinding sound of stone on stone, a small, perfectly cut block at the base of the statue receded into a hidden cavity. Inside, wrapped in a thick, waxed oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound book. It was damp and cold to the touch, but it was intact. Clara Miller's insurance policy. He retreated to the quiet solitude of his truck just as a soft, melancholic rain began to fall, the drops tapping a gentle rhythm on the roof. He opened the journal. The first page read, in neat, youthful cursive, the last words of Clara Miller. He began to read, and the voice of a brave, terrified young woman reached out across 20 years of silence. The early entries were filled with the simple joys and anxieties of a teenage girl, her friendship with Amelia, their shared dreams of escaping Harmony Valley. But a thread of fear quickly wove its way into the narrative. Clara wrote of the change in Evan Wentworth after he began dating Amelia, his new anxieties, his fearful whispers about his family and their responsibilities. She and Amelia had given them a nickname, the Parliament of Owls, because they seemed to be a secret society of old men who watched everything from the shadows. The journal chronicled Amelia's growing determination to free Evan from his family's grip, and Clara's own mounting terror that they were meddling with forces they didn't understand. Then came the entry that made Brody's blood run cold. It was dated the day after Amelia's disappearance. Evan came to my window last night, Clara had written. He was a mess. Crying, hysterical. He told me everything. His father and Sheriff Evans met Amelia at the bridge. They argued. He said his father pushed her, that she fell, that she was gone. And he said the Sheriff Evans, was the one who took charge, who told him to be quiet, who cleaned everything up. They are making him say she ran away. They threatened him. I don't know what to do. I have to do something. I can't let them get away with this. The final entry was written 2 days later, the handwriting hurried and blotched with what looked like tear stains. I went to see Sheriff Evans. I had to. I told him what I knew. I thought he was a good man. He was. That was the most horrible part. He was so kind, so calm. He listened to everything I had to say. He didn't threaten me. He didn't yell. He just looked at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen and said that Harmony Valley was a special place that needed to be protected, and that sometimes, protecting it required terrible sacrifices. He told me I had 2 choices. I could stay, and my sacrifice would be to end up just like Amelia. Or I could leave, and my sacrifice would be my entire life. He gave me an envelope filled with cash and a one-way train ticket to Oregon. He told me to build a new life, to forget Harmony Valley, and to never ever come back. He said it was the only way he could protect me. So I'm running. I'm leaving this journal behind, under the weeping angel, because I can't bear the thought that no one will ever know the truth about what they did to Amelia. Someone has to remember. Brody closed the journal, the soft leather cool against his skin. The rain streamed down his windshield, blurring the world outside. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. His father hadn't been a monster who killed for pleasure. He had been something far more chilling, a man who had sacrificed his own soul to be the cold, efficient enforcer of a corrupt peace. He had covered up one murder and, in his own twisted way, had saved the life of the only witness by exiling her forever. Brody now knew the full, tragic scope of the dark secret of Harmony Valley. The violence, the cover-ups, the exiles. The final task was not about revenge or even justice anymore. It was about remembrance. It was time to bring all the ghosts home. 3 months later, the first snow of winter fell on Harmony Valley. It came in the night, a silent, gentle absolution, blanketing the town in a layer of pure, untarnished white. The dark corners where secrets had festered for generations were now covered, and under the pale morning sun, the valley looked, for the first time in a century, truly peaceful. The dark secret was out, exposed to the harsh light of day, and in its place, a quiet, difficult healing had begun. The Parliament of Owls was no more. Its members, stripped of their power and prestige, were awaiting trial, their names now spoken not with reverence, but with a mixture of pity and contempt. Mayor Wentworth, a broken man, had confessed to everything, his son Evan's life-altering injury, from which he was now slowly, painstakingly recovering, being the final, tragic catalyst. The ledger, authenticated and dissected by state prosecutors, had laid bare the full scope of their reign. Dr. Alastair, Principal Abernathy, Judge Preston. They were all facing a litany of charges that would ensure they would never again cast their shadows over the town. Deputy Mark Riley, for his courage and integrity, was now acting chief, a steady hand guiding the town's small police force back toward the light. The town itself was wounded, its citizens grappling with the profound betrayal, but a new spirit was taking hold. A spirit of transparency, of community, of finally talking about the ghosts that had been ignored for too long. For Sheriff Brody Evans, the last few months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings and personal reckonings. He had overseen the transfer of all evidence to the state, ensuring the case against the Parliament was ironclad. He had helped Jacob Vance, now a free man in every sense of the word, get settled. Jacob had decided to stay, his carpentry skills now being used to help renovate the old town library, a symbolic act of rebuilding the very place where the town's history had been hidden and lied about for so long. But 2 final duties remained. The first was a journey. Following the directions from Clara's journal, Brody and a state investigator had found her. She was living a quiet life as a librarian in a small coastal town in Oregon. Brody went to see her alone. He found her in a small coffee shop overlooking the Pacific Ocean. She was older, her face etched with the lines of a life lived in constant low-grade fear, but her eyes were still sharp and intelligent. He slid her old journal across the table. "This belongs to you," he said softly. "It's over, Clara. They're all in custody. You're safe." Tears streamed down her face as she touched the worn leather cover, a relic from a life she thought she had buried forever. Can I go home?" she whispered. "Whenever you're ready," Brody assured her. "Your brother is waiting for you." For the first time in 20 years, the woman who had been forced to become a ghost could finally reclaim her own name. His final duty was the hardest. He went to the cemetery, a fresh bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. He walked past the weeping angel, now just a sad statue, and went to a simpler grave. Thomas Evans. Husband, father, sheriff. He stood before the stone for a long time, the cold winter air biting at his cheeks. He had spent his life trying to live up to the myth of this man, only to discover the terrible truth. He couldn't forgive his father for the choices he had made, for the laws he had broken, for the lives he had helped shatter. But in the silence of the cemetery, he could finally understand the tragic, flawed humanity of it all. He was not his father's son in sin, but in his love for this valley. Brody's legacy would be to fix what his father had helped break. He laid the flowers on the grave, a gesture not of honor, but of a quiet, final farewell. He turned and walked away, not looking back, stepping out of his father's long shadow and into the light of his own future. Later that day, there was a service. The whole town gathered, not at the church, but at a newly erected, simple stone monument in the town square. On it were 2 names, Amelia Thompson and Clara Miller. One who was lost, and one who was found. It was a memorial service, but it was also a promise. A promise to never let secrets fester in the darkness again. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered mountains, Brody stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the same ridge where he and Jacob had planned their desperate heist. The lights of the town were beginning to twinkle on, warm and inviting. It was still the same valley, the same collection of houses and streets. But it was different now. It was honest. It was free. The dark secret of Harmony Valley had finally been laid to rest, and in its place, something new, something true, could finally begin to grow.